Welcome. I'm Harmony Slater, your host of the Finding Harmony podcast. Over the past 20 years, I've taught thousands of yoga teachers and students to explore the intersection between ancient wisdom and modern everyday life, using mind-body practices to heal, awaken, and manifest their dreams from the inside out. This podcast is a sanctuary for those feeling overwhelmed by life's challenges. Are you ready to jump in and discover how these challenges aren't actually in the way, but are the way to finding harmony? Let's invite the magic back in. Hi, welcome. I'm so excited you're here today. Today we have a wonderful guest, Daniel Simpson, who is the author of a book called The Truth of Yoga. And he's been studying yoga, the ancient texts, from a scholarly perspective for many, many years, drawing on a master's degree in yoga studies and over 20 years of experience. We are going to dive into what he's learned and his impressions of the yogic traditions. He's also the host of a wonderfully interesting podcast called Ancient Futures. So if you're looking for more inspiration and want to find out about the truth of yoga and a rough guide to the dark side, you can check out his writings and his blog as well as his podcast. But don't go anywhere just yet, because we are connecting with him today and diving into a lot of these interesting topics about yoga and the use of yoga in modern times, as well as how it has changed and transformed from its ancient uses, and whether this is a good thing or a negative thing. So I think you're really going to love this conversation. It is wonderful for all the people who want to go deeper into the study of yoga. And if you're a yoga nerd like we are, you're gonna really, really vibe on it. It's an incredible conversation. And this week, it is International Yoga Day. So if you would like to honor International Yoga Day and give back to yoga, give back to India, the people of India, and do something really nice and really special, head on over to my personal fundraising page for Yoga Gives Back, and let's give a little bit back to the women and the young girls in India who can really use our support and our help. We help them through microloans and through scholarships for higher education. And I would just love it if you would support me in supporting Yoga Gives Back, and we can fundraise together and create an incredible outcome for these women and children that we support through our local NGOs. So without further ado, let's jump in. Hi, welcome to the Finding Harmony podcast. I'm so happy you're here joining us today. We're going to have a fun episode. Russell Case is joining me.
You've just dragged me out of bed. Thank you very much for that.
I'm honored, Russell. Thank you.
Yeah. And we're meeting with the very esteemed Daniel Simpson. I think you're quite famous in England, but maybe in North America.
I would say that.
Yes, come on.
in a very small corner of the internet where the yoga nerds hang out, maybe some have heard of me.
That's right. To all the yoga nerds out there, this is someone you need to know, Daniel Simpson. He is the author of a book called The Truth of Yoga. And he has many tutorials and courses all on the history and exploring authentic yoga traditions. What is authenticity? Is that how you would describe it?
That would be a good way of describing it. Yeah. I mean, it's often very tempting to imagine that we need to go back to the texts and, mold ourselves to the worldview of 2,000 years ago, which I don't think is really very realistic or very likely to happen. Authenticity is something we have to think about a bit differently, I think. It's about how we relate to reality here and now.
Yes. Where I grew up in central Illinois, they very much wanted me to adhere to sacred texts that were originated 2,000 years ago. Disappointed when I left.
You know what I'm talking about there.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to dive into a little bit of like what is authenticity and what is yoga. I think that'd be really fun to talk about. And I think it's something you have so much expertise on because you teach at SOAS
Oxford.
and at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. And also you have a podcast called Ancient Futures, which is really, really amazing with many incredible authors on there.
Are you in Oxbridge yourself?
Yeah, well, I went to Cambridge University many years ago as an undergraduate, and I live
Cambridge.
I live outside Oxford and come in and out of Oxford, so I guess I'm Oxbridge. I've got a foot in both camps.
That is, yeah. I learned that term when I lived in Sussex, and it's like, yeah, she's an Oxbridge. I was like, that doesn't make any fucking sense.
An Oxbridge.
Is she one or the other, mate? You're kind of maybe a bit more from the north, and I know the British people hate talking about where they're from, but you're is it Yorkshire? What's going on there?
Further north, yeah, that would be
further
south.
north than Yorkshire. You're
Indeed.
kidding. No, it's
Tyne and Weir.
It's
would be
grim
the
in
technical
Yorkshire.
term. It's grim up north, as they say.
It is,
Tyne and Weir, Newcastle.
Newcastle.
Yeah.
Right.
Cool.
Although you can't hear it in my accent, it's true.
No,
at all.
it's been sort of molded by the streams. Yeah.
It has, yeah. I think living abroad had a lot to do with it, speaking to other people who weren't speaking English as their first language, and working with lots of people from lots of different countries. So, yeah, that kind of had a bit of an influence. And then, these days, living in the south of England, haven't lived in the north for 30-odd years. So, yeah, it's just all gone.
Right.
Wow.
Were your parents academics?
They were not, no. My dad worked for an electronics company. My mum was originally a school teacher and then wound up doing various forms of social work.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah. So stalwart upper middle class then.
I would say lower, but with aspirations.
She's a school teacher. That puts you right there, doesn't it?
I don't know.
It puts you right there at the bottom of the survivability income bracket. Yeah.
That's right.
But it's
like
separate.
what, 30,000 pounds a year?
Class
Maybe.
is separate from wealth in England, isn't it?
Well, that's true. You can have no money at all and be the elite. Yeah.
That's right. And just walk around with your old money and
Old no money, your title.
Your old titles, yeah.
Open your crumbling house to the public and get them to pay for it.
Would you think of yourself as sort of a politicized youth? Is that how you ended up in Cambridge?
Interesting question. I think I got politicised a little bit by my experience of going to Cambridge. I felt a certain amount of a chip on my shoulder, and I think I got more politicised by what I did after that, which was to go and be a journalist and working as a foreign correspondent, and ultimately working for an American newspaper that was facilitating the invasion of Iraq. I got radicalised.
Yeah. You got radicalised in the Near East. How novel.
There you go. Yeah.
Were you in Iraq?
I wasn't, though. Actually, I was in the Balkans, and I was hired to write about the Balkans right after 9/11, when the Americans still had, I think, 60,000 soldiers in Kosovo, and they thought they wanted to know about that part of the world, but they actually didn't. And what they really wanted was lots of stories about, how we needed to go and deal with Saddam Hussein, and so various reporters served those up. And I just sat there incredulous with not a lot to do, a lot of time on my hands, far too much weed in my bloodstream, and I went off the rails, would be the honest answer.
Wow.
So that's when I got into yoga, to recover from that, to be honest, yeah.
Recover, it sounds like an opening, not a
Was it
injury.
was it traumatic or just pure boredom?
Well, I suppose at the time it was, I was angry. I thought it shouldn't be this way. I had lots of delusional ideas about the media. I had lots of delusional ideas about myself, I suppose, having gone to Cambridge and thought of myself as an achiever. I thought I was better than this, and I thought that the people I worked with, who were obviously smart, should be better than that too. And nobody wanted to talk about it. Everybody sort of coughed uncomfortably, and were waiting for, a couple of years to go by when they could write the stories about how they knew all along it was nonsense. But at that moment, it was just not the done thing to admit that this was clearly a stunt. And so I just didn't know what to do.
You can hear just under his breath that he would have referred to his colleagues like, oh, he was a twat.
Well, there is, yeah. I mean, I would have used a stronger synonym, Russell. in fact.
Stronger than that.
Wow.
Yeah.
See you next
at the
Tuesday.
time. Yeah. Indeed. In fact, I did draft a resignation letter in which I said something of that sort, but
Wow.
I toned it down and just sort of said, I don't think I want to stay, thanks. And they didn't really know what to make of that.
It's very British of you.
It was really, yeah. Sorry.
Sorry, I don't want to stay. Thank you.
And did you immediately go on the kind of Marrakesh trail, or did you go back home for some time, or you
Well, yeah, it's a long story. I suppose it all started. We go back to Cambridge when I didn't really know what to do there to fit in, and I discovered that the best way to fit in would be hiding out in my room with my friend playing video games and smoking bongs. And so that was when I developed a tolerance and a taste for overindulgence in the herb, and that, I guess, led me to being interested in hanging out in the Himalayas after I left university and before I became a journalist, which was where I discovered crazy Indian characters who smoked a lot of hashish and sat around fires and called themselves yogis. And so I thought, that sounds good. I want to be one of those, but I didn't know
You're
anything
like,
about
that's the kind of yoga
anything
I want to
except
do.
Let's just get high. Yeah, great, cool. So yeah, that was.
What was that like?
I
Where did you go? Where were you?
The tourist trail, up in the foothills, mainly Manali initially, and then I sort of wandered off into the middle of nowhere, up above Manali. And,
Amazing. Did you
fun.
go up to like Gangotri and?
I didn't on that trip, and I've still never made it there. I kept saying that's where I was going to go next. I went up to Ladakh that time, and then I went sort of
Ladakh's
along
amazing.
the Ganges, to Varanasi, and ended up also going to the Sangam in Allahabad. It was right after the Kumbh Mela, and I thought, I'm going to have to go to the next Kumbh Mela that had been in Hardwar that year, but I wanted to check out the site. It looked amazing, so I went back in 2001 to the Mahakumbh Mela. And at that time, still not really a yoga practitioner in conventional modern Western parlance, but really into hanging out with chain smokers. And so I sort of went there and spent a few days getting lost in the middle of millions of people, and started to wonder, how does any of this actually relate to yoga, which was, I suppose, what led to me eventually, once I realised I couldn't get high all day long forever,
Wow.
going to an asana class and discovering, actually, there's something I can do with my body and my mind that, doesn't get me quite as high, but is perhaps a little more sustainable.
Not quite as high, no, that's been my experience.
So for those people who, I don't know if everyone knows what the Mahakumbh Mela is, maybe you can just describe it. Like, how many millions of people show up at this one city in India, and what is going on there? What was your experience?
Wow, yeah. I mean, it's the biggest gathering of people on the planet, would be the simplest way of summing it up. The numbers that people give are, on the one hand, totally unbelievable, and at the same time, quite plausible. So they say on the busiest days that, more than 10 million people are on this site. So the population of Greater London condensed into this mass. And I remember after the very busiest bathing day in 2001, decamping to a hotel on the outskirts of Allahabad and just watching this endless stream of people for a couple of days, walking off site, carrying their belongings on their head. So it's a pilgrimage, basically, to the meeting of the Ganges and the Yamuna rivers at the most sacred of the four sites that it sort of rotates between. And the idea is you wash in the holy waters and cleanse your sins, and try not to swallow any of the holy waters, because they might cleanse all sorts of other things out of your body as well, like its immune system.
Yeah.
Is there any sort of yoga going on there? Does it have anything to do with yoga, in your opinion?
Well, yeah, I mean, I remember hanging out. This was a very sort of strange conversation that I've got somewhere on a mini disc with a Western acolyte of a chap who called himself Pilot Bubba. And he was a former Indian Air Force pilot, and he had this camp where he would show off some of his tricks, and he taught samadhi. And I remember this very earnest New Yorker, I think Joseph was his name, sitting there telling me, I'm here. This guy really has got the key, and I'm really making progress in my practice of samadhi. And I just sat there, chain smoking. What's samadhi? And I've got this interview somewhere. I must re-listen to it, because he did try to explain, and I just didn't get it at all. So there was, in that sense, right there in at the deep end practice of yoga. There were all sorts of characters giving, lectures about various aspects of yoga philosophy. But the main event is these naked sadhus who are there as sort of, I guess the embodiment of what we, as far as we can tell, would call the earliest yogis, world-renouncing types who sort of hung out with no possessions, smearing themselves in ash with dreadlocked hair, and they line up in order in procession to go and bathe first before everybody else, and sometimes have fights as to who gets to go first, because they've also got a history of being mercenary soldiers, these orders of sadhus. And so, they would call themselves yogis, and they might not do anything particularly yogic in our current conception. But they do go in, some of them, for austerities. There's one particular character who I met that time who had his arm in the air for as long as I'd been alive, and it was withered, and I couldn't really see the point. I remember thinking that's a remarkable stubbornness. But I started to understand that actually there's a strong connection. I mean, it's pure tapas, pure self-discipline, pure will. But
you sound just like Lord Chelmsford there. Remarkable stubbornness.
I mean, it's an incredible event that does happen in India. And I think that is the thing, is that it attracts all of these sadhus, all of these holy men, saints, sages, thieves, everyone to this area, because they come out of the hills, of the mountains where they, usually hide, basically, or hang out, I guess, in India, and then come down to the Ganges. And so it's sort of this auspicious opportunity to really see what yoga is in India, actually. And so that's like a strong initiation into the yoga path. Holy cow.
I mean, I had dabbled once or twice. I'd been to some meditation classes and struggled to meditate and decided that wasn't really for me. I'd been to a couple of asana classes, felt really stiff, and again, not really kept up with it. I bought Light on Yoga, but never really opened it. And this stuff, kept me captivated. There wasn't any light, no, Russell. It was the dark side I took first. I went the roundabout route, let's say.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear like the different paths people take into yoga, and it's no wonder that you have this like attraction now to, or that it developed, of really exploring the origins and how did like this, beautiful cover girl on Yoga Journal end up representing yoga when the experience you were initiated into was, dirty, a bunch of people chain smoking, as you say, naked sadhus, like absolutely no like physical sort of pristine westernized beauty of the body. A bunch of naked men pulling like tractors with their penises and different crazy things. Right?
Nice pull, sweetie.
But pull and all sorts of double meanings. But I think the real beauty of having seen that is to realize exactly that. It isn't pretty. It's not about the body. Yoga was never supposed to be about the body. Yoga is about, perhaps in the later phases of its evolution, exploring a way through the body to see beyond the body. But, it's never just been about the body until the 20th century. And that's when it got merged with, health and wellness on the one hand, physical exercise on the other, and it's quite hard to make the old philosophies fit together with that. It's something else.
And it's something else I was curious, like I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, because you were talking, I was listening to something you were talking about sort of these ancient origins of yoga and this tapas, or this austerity that turns into, as Krishna says, sort of like tamasic discipline in a way, like holding your arm in the air for years and years and years. And it got me thinking, is interesting, because I feel like at some point it's a discipline to hold your arm in the air for years and years and years. But at a certain point, that discipline, that austerity becomes easier than actually bringing your hand back down.
Yeah, the guy who was talking about, Amabarti was his name, he couldn't bring his arm down if he'd wanted to. It was locked there. It was destroyed. He'd wrecked his arm. In the end, yes, there's no discipline left. It's a bit like the sadhus who wreck their penises to prove that they don't want to have sex, but they've made it impossible anyway, so there's no discipline needed.
Yeah. Right?
There's a sense of ease to the practice.
Yeah, and so sometimes I think like it's so interesting, like yoga as sort of this morphing, if we take yoga in a more traditional sense of like yoga's chitta vritti nirodha, the channeling or the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind or of the desire and the aversion, or having a steady, balanced mind, transcending the gunas, all of these different forces acting on us. If we look at it this way, it's so interesting because, and a teacher once said this to me, my pranayama teacher, he said, too much sattva turns into tamas. And it really is kind of the way that, the discipline at some point cancels itself out. It no longer becomes difficult or hard because you've gone past sort of
a threshold.
And then the discipline is actually to give up, like the challenge then, or the austerity is then to give up the discipline, which becomes very hard because now your ego's attached to this discipline.
Give up all technique and come to me. That's the
Give
end.
up all technique and
That's
come
the
to
end
me.
of the Bhagavad Gita. Yeah, that's it.
Imagine how many Ashtangis are going to sign up for that. No
Right?
more asana ever again. Just let go. It's fine.
These twisted old inflamed corpuses that are seniors in the Ashtanga yoga practice. A lot of them. They can just do like a couple of postures anyway. And I think that you could say that they're unable to, or that's really, they're really giving it all they can. Or they're just, really kind of settling into the ease of the practice. I think that there might be some kind of real wisdom there as not being body obsessed. There's a couple.
Yeah, but there's a difference also between maybe like choosing to give up the practice and come to me versus it being taken away from you and you not having a choice and lamenting about.
Is there a difference between giving up and having it taken from you?
I think we've got right to the core of what is yoga in that very question, Russell, because it's it's about the intentionality. There, I think, has to be something of that in there. Otherwise, if you could put on a headset that stilled your mind without you having to do anything, which I'm sure we'll soon have the opportunity to test, would that be yoga, or would that just be sort of outsourcing it all to technology? It's not just about the results, it's about the transformation that takes place to make the result happen. So the mind becomes still, not because you're so stubborn that you've stopped it moving. It's because you've, removed the sources of the agitation that creates the problem in the first place, which are related to the inability to let things be as they are, which is something that we all find very challenging on some level. Any time I hear that said, I end up thinking, yeah, but there's some things shouldn't be the way that they are. And, of course, we live in the world, we like things to be a certain way, but the extent to which we need them to be a certain way is the extent to which we're hooked and at the mercy of circumstance. And the idea of yoga was to become independent. And it's the same principles there in the Buddha's teachings. It's why we suffer, and that's how we get out of the problem of suffering, is to be able to just be with things. And so if there is some intentional engagement with a practice that unhooks us from that sticky source, then something is changed. If we're just through circumstances forced to let go because our body will no longer do things, much easier for as you say, the lamentation to still be there. They're like, I wish I could, and never mind, I'm going to pretend it's all okay now that I just do a couple of asanas rather than bust out the third or fourth series. That's a different thing to sort of, well, I could if I wanted to, but actually I've seen through the illusion of that as the path to anything. That's just a way of feeling better in my body on some level and a way of finding a little bit more steadiness and ease. But what if I could just do that in this moment? And of course, that's much harder. So that's why we do these practices. And I've had to find that out for myself as a result of getting older and more crippled. I've got arthritic hips. Well, these things happen. I feel like I shouldn't be old enough to have arthritis, but I do. And as a result, I just can't do what I used to do. And the last couple of years, I've really let go of asana practice in the way that I thought of it. And I also found it very hard to sit cross-legged. So I became much less willing, I suppose, to make time to sit in meditation, and stubborn enough to say chairs aren't really the thing. And then a couple of years go by and I'm losing all of my practices, and I realized that actually just talking about the ideas is all very well, but those practices were making the ideas manifest in my experience of life in a way that just talking about them doesn't. And so I've been trying to find my way back, sort of what's the minimum amount of engagement in some of this stuff that reactivates that process for me, rather than just going for it full power because I can't get enough of the feel good vibe.
Well, I'm fascinated by this because that's such an extraordinarily profound answer to a devilishly simple question. And how did you go from smoking hash at the Kumbh Mela and then have no idea what's going on to then fast forward, 40 years later, to this podcast where you have such a profundity of knowledge on this subject? How do you make that transition? What did you do?
Oh, that's very flattering. I think one thing, though, that I should probably say is I stopped smoking so much hash, and I thought I was very profound when I was really high. And I've got notebooks full of gibberish to demonstrate that wasn't quite the case. I think, to be honest, it was I was always a seeker on some level. I always wanted to know the answer. When I was younger, that was very intellectual, arrogant, and fact-based. And I liked to think if I could just sort of get a handle on the right information, I had some power. And I sort of proved that to myself by jumping through all the hoops and passing exams, winding up at Cambridge, getting, a fancy job at the New York Times. I thought, I'm really somebody here. And when all of that fell away, I quit my job. I decided instead to organise a music festival in Serbia in 2003, modelled on the Kumbh Mela in Belgrade, the capital of Serbia. There are two rivers that meet, the Sava and the Danube, just like the Yamuna and the Ganges. That's and amazing. At the meeting point of these two rivers is an island. It's called Veliko Ratno Ostrvo, and that means Big War Island. So I wanted to stage the third Summer of Love on Big War Island. And so we organised this festival. It happened. Lots of people came. But all the money got stolen. I have no idea to this day exactly who did it, but the prime candidates were the dodgy characters who I was in partnership with and some of the gangsters we got involved with to be able to do the event in the first place. So I sort of fled Serbia in a panic, thinking all of my ideas about myself are clearly deluded. I can't figure out what's trustworthy or not. I was disillusioned with my employers. I was disillusioned with my alternative career path. And I smoked so much hash to try and deal with that I lost my mind. And I realised, something had to give. And I wound up back in the UK. I went to an Iyengar yoga class, and I spent the next 10 years or so being disciplined by largely dominatrixes in the Iyengar world, telling me what to do, telling me what I was doing wrong. And I liked it. I think I needed some punishment. I wanted to atone for my misdeeds. And so I suppose I felt like I had to start learning properly, Russell. I felt like, before I was an arrogant young man who thought he had all the answers. And as I got older, I realised, I don't really know anything. And I need to go back to first principles. What does it actually mean to know? What is this knowledge that I thought I had? It was just information. And there was something, which is why I was interested in going to the Kumbh Mela in the first place, that some of the people I met there, whether they were Indian sadhus or whether they were European hippies who'd been hanging out like sadhus for the previous few decades, they just had something. And it was a way in which they related to the moment. And there seemed to be a wisdom in it, and it wasn't something I could get my hands on. It wasn't information that I could take off the shelf and fill my head with in the same way. Something had to change within me. And I wanted to know how to do it. And so that just kept taking me deeper into this inquiry. First of all, going to the classes, changing a little bit the way my mind and body functioned, being less and less interested in getting high until I just stopped doing that. Then becoming more interested in, why are we doing this stuff? What's it all about? And then reading the texts that I was told to read, like the Gita and the Yoga Sutras, and realizing they had absolutely nothing to do with a lot of what we were doing in the asana class, and thinking, well, they're getting at something else. And, we're all having a nice time here, making shapes with our bodies. How many Iyengar yoga teachers got enlightened was the sort of rude question bubbling up at the back of my mind. And so, I wanted to find people who knew. And then I went and hung out in India for a long time, being a yoga bum. doing what I could to sort of tap into people who seemed to have more of an answer. Then I went back to university and tried to get answers from academics who, had a lot of knowledge about the source material, about the history, know a lot more than me about all of that. Most of what I share is based on the information that I've learned from them. But at the same time, still, I never found my guru in that world who was going to just say, look, follow me and you'll get enlightened. So what I've learned, I suppose, is I have to think for myself, but I have to question myself. And so every time I think I know anything, it's a lovely line in the Kena Upanishad, which basically says, if you think you know, then, you probably do know something. But what you have to do is reflect on the immensity of what you don't know, because that's where you're going to get some wisdom. All of this stuff that you think you know is just going to delude you. If you hang on to that, you'll just be wandering around, with a tiny fragment of knowledge, calling yourself enlightened. Whereas if you really want to see beyond all of that, you need to keep throwing away the sense that I know and embrace I don't know. And I suppose I've been trying to do more and more of that. But obviously having to teach means I have to pretend to know. And people ask me questions and I have to give answers. And then, I rather audaciously wrote a book with a title like The Truth of Yoga, trying to say, there is some truth. But no, what I wanted to say in that book really was, to be honest, that was not the original title. I was persuaded by my partner at the time not to go with my working title, which was Yoga Without the Bullshit. She said, why don't you turn it round the other way?
That's a bestseller, I think.
No, I should have done it. I think she was right in that it was more respectful to the tradition, but in the end, it should have just gone there and been more ballsy.
Second edition.
Yeah.
Retitle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because there's a lot of bullshit that has been, I guess, added to ideas about yoga in the Western world in particular, but in India also. And somewhere at the base of it is, a really time-tested framework for seeing through your own bullshit. And that's something that I try to be guided by. But, day by day, I keep throwing up more bullshit for myself. So it's a lifelong path.
I think that's the key, though, is like questioning everything. Because when you really stop and question everything, like your beliefs about everything,
the meanings of words,
you come to the state or the experience of like non-verbal sort of just being at some point, right? You can tap into presence, and isn't that the whole point of practice?
Yeah, and that's going right back to the beginning again, the earliest Upanishads, before anybody even talked about yoga as this sort of thing, a state of being. We're saying, the way to know Brahman is to give up language. Before they reach it, words turn back, says the Taittiriya Upanishad. So it's just, it's not possible to put this stuff into language. It's a pre-conceptual way of approaching life. But obviously we need concepts to function in the world. So, pretending that you can Neo-Advaita style, just nothing to do, nowhere to go, no one to be, nothing to think. And here I am, it's all very well. You still have to somehow get this delicate balance between knowing for functional purposes and knowing that that's not the true knowing.
There's something else that I think's interesting that you brought up, and I'd love to kind of hear your take on it. When I think of, like Buddhism and yoga are so similar, and I think yoga is actually more similar to Buddhism than it is to like Hinduism, actually, like in all of its sort of greatness. I don't know. Vedanta is kind of something else, but yeah.
I just am suspicious of the word Hinduism as well.
I know. I'm just saying, but like Hinduism as like Vaishnavites, Shaivites, like Charaka, like as it, all the deities, all the mythology, everything from the Vedas. Yoga, I think, is more similar to Buddhism than like this sort of vast traditional kind of pujas and ceremonies and all of the things. But where I think they're kind of different, and I'd love to hear what you think about this, is they both start, from this same place of life is suffering, and the problem of suffering is desire, or our response to our senses, to stimulus. And then Buddhism says, well, then we can control desire. We stop desire. And yoga kind of says the same thing in a way, right? Like then we start to do some practices to dull our attraction to the world. But it seems to me that yoga is really about like this idea of changing your relationship to the world. And so it feels a bit more external, which is, I think, where we get this idea of like changing our body. You know, like there's this real like, let's withdraw from the world so we're no longer kind of tempted by it. And it becomes almost like a self-absorbed practice. Whereas I feel like Buddhism actually is more about like, the problem isn't the world. The problem is in you, in how you're relating to the world. And so all you have to do is change yourself and you can just be in the world, right? And you get all these aphorisms like before enlightenment, chop wood, after enlightenment, chop wood, right? Like there is no difference. It's not about actually coming out of the world. It's about changing your inner world. Whereas yoga, I believe, and here's where you can bring all of your expertise in, is really about kind of withdrawing from the world. And even though it's about changing yourself, it's like, no, you're going to change your whole life.
Yeah,
and
you've
actually,
really
the world is
put your
something to
finger on it
be
there.
like avoided at all costs.
Think,
almost.
first of all, to come back to Russell's point about the definitions of words, you know, we've got to acknowledge that yoga has many different philosophies, and although there is a sort of early core to it, it gets taken in different directions, and so we really need to get sort of focused on a particular source. So if we were to talk about the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, it's very similar to Buddhism and probably manifests exactly the distinction you were describing. But some of the later yoga traditions are influenced much more by tantric philosophy that ends up embracing the world from a completely different sort of philosophical standpoint, but at the same time very similarly to what Buddhism ends up doing, of just saying it's all interconnected, and so it's about how you relate to it, and therefore nothing is to be turned away from on that level. But coming back to the beginning and the basics, I mean, that's why the guy sticks his arm in the air. It's to prove that he doesn't, have any need to engage in the desire to bring it down. And he can do that for so long that it's actually impossible to bring it down. He's conquered desire. So at the crudest level, that's what you do. You renounce the world, you renounce your desire to feed the sensory apparatus with objects of satisfaction. Instead, you take your satisfaction somewhere else, and the ultimate satisfaction is in not needing anything. A lot of these texts say so. That's a famous line in the Mahabharata that gets quoted in the commentary on the Yoga Sutra. Says it's basically 16 times better than all the pleasures in heaven, and everything you can get from worldly love is this pleasure that you get from not wanting anything. So that's the ultimate goal, to not want anything. But the best way to achieve it from the yoga perspective is to find this thing that isn't caught up in the changing cycle of things coming into being and then falling to pieces again. And that's this idea of a self, and it's permanent and it's timeless, and you can somehow step outside of the wheel of chaos and not come back again and have to do any more of it by being this sort of Atman or Purusha that stands outside of time. And Buddhism doesn't have that. It says that is just another illusion, the idea of this permanent anything. All we have is this interconnected web of causes and conditions that bring things into being so that they can fall apart again. And if you try and hang on to any of it as a fixed identity, you're lost. So I think that automatically emphasizes the world on some level, even though a lot of early Buddhist practice does still involve, being a renunciate. It's still at the same time promoting the idea that there's nowhere to go except here in the world. The world is all that there is. The world is not enough, too bad, it's all you've got. Whereas yoga seems to say, the world is not enough because there's this otherworldliness that we can step into. And it's perhaps two different ways of talking about the same thing, seeing the world through an unafflicted mind. Both Buddhism and yoga basically say that the mind at its sort of simplest level is clear and pure, but it's contaminated by these defilements, and so we have to do something to get them out of the way. And they describe the result of that differently. The result in the Buddhist context is, you just see fully, without any delusion, the causes of suffering, and the fact that there is no inherent sort of fixed permanent self, and that everything is interconnected web of dependently arising things. Whereas the yoga world says, you step outside and you see that you are the true self, unaffected by anything. And at the same time, they're basically talking about the same state of being that, as you said, is simply just presence. It's the ability to be with stuff as it is, and to not be, contaminating our perception of it with preconceived ideas that usually relate to I like or I don't like. We form a whole identity out of I like and I don't like. You look at things like dating profiles and they're just long lists of I like, I don't like. It's like people ultimate marketing. It's like, here I am, desire me, and I'm just this long list of likes and dislikes. That's not who you are.
That was always something really interesting for me when I started doing more in business and looking at building a business and how to build a business, a successful business, an online business. And so much of it is about bringing your unique personality to the forefront and, highlighting all of your achievements or the experiences you've had. And, all of these things work to, give you your professional abilities or your unique ability to help someone, or how you're teaching, how you're all this, right? And I remember thinking, but I'm not anyone. Exactly. All of my yoga trainings just taught me to see that all is like an illusion and garbage, and I had to really activate a different part of my brain because I was so feeling very non-attached to my life, actually, anything that ever happened to me. It didn't seem like something to be elevated. And then I'm like, oh, people really find this interesting, right? Kind of like I find it super interesting. You went to the Kumbh Mela, but maybe for you, you're like, what? That was so long ago. Who cares?
Put it on my resume. Yeah. To that point, there was something about our talk in a previous podcast with Mr. Balachandran about this notion of karma. And I was trying to get to this point exactly, that I was just we should be getting to a place where we're accepting the natural presence and just being there. And I could feel him sort of pushing with his more Vedantic point of view, or from the perspective of Patanjali, that we should really be pushing towards, working on karma, past karma, and then really working hard to improve our karma. And I felt like that was where the schism was. And I feel like that's almost kind of at the heart of your consternation with your CV.
Well, indeed. Yeah, I mean, let's get it back to basics. Karma is action as well as the consequences of action. And, doing is the source of identity. The sort of other side of it is you go to a party or do any kind of work, socializing, and the first question, what do you do? So that's who you are. So you're a walking CV. And, obviously to be taken seriously, you have to push forward some of that. You're never going to get hired in a job interview if you don't talk up your identity in terms of achievements. So that's part of functioning in the world. And I think the key to all of this is to realize, I suppose, that there are two levels. There is what we have to do for day-to-day purposes, and then there is this sort of, I guess, ultimate truth or spiritual domain, for want of a better way of putting it. What might be true on that level is not necessarily very helpful in the day-to-day life point of view. On the one hand, we could get fundamentalist and say you've just identified why the words yoga and business don't belong together. But if you live in the world, and, you want to pay the bills, at some point, it's just not going to work to sit there and say, well, I don't take money for my services. I'm just, the local wisdom keeper. If you feel like chucking a few coins in my pot, please do. We're just not going to be able to function in a Western urban situation that way. So business has to come into it on some level. And I guess it's trying to engage as lightly as possible with the necessary evil, let's say, of pretending to play the game. And I like how Alan Watts used to talk about it. He would say that we're just playing a game, playing a role. This personality is, it's an illusion, but the answer to seeing through the illusion is not to give up and lie down and say there's nothing else to do. It's to enjoy the fact that you're playing a game and, putting on this costume to step out in, and to do it as lightheartedly as if it was a performance for fun rather than as a desperate attempt to be affirmed. And there's such an interest these days in having other people affirm us. I only really exist when I'm hearing it back from you guys that you see me the way that I think I am, rather than it's just a role. I can just play it. It doesn't really matter. And maybe it serves its purpose, and then I don't get so identified with it. But the other way, we get very identified, and we really need things from the world.
Yeah, then yoga becomes all of life, and yoga and business go together because you can bring that to the business, right? You can bring that playfulness, that recognizing that actually this is just an illusion like everything else that I'm doing in this world. It's just for fun.
Well,
in a way.
to a certain extent, although at the end of the day, it does put, zeros at the end of numbers on screens, and so there is cash. And then I guess part of it is, what I like from the Buddhist tradition is the concept of right livelihood. What is the way of actually engaging with money that is dharmic, shall we say? And I don't have the fixed answer, but I think, as with everything related to Dharma, the fact that the question arises is helpful. How much is enough? There's a lot of people out there who seem to think it's an unanswerable question and they just need more and more and more. And I think yoga is very strongly emphasizing consistently in all of its teachings, the accumulation of stuff is no good for your practice and also completely irrelevant. So at a certain point, enough stuff. So we have to, I think, for ourselves, have some sense of where the limit is with that and then be able to give it away, whether that's in terms of letting people join us for no money sometimes or finding some way. I mean, I'm not at the stage where I feel like I've got billions to give away in a foundation or anything, but just finding some way to give back and to see it as an exchange. And the idea that you might die with a big pile of cash and possessions seems to me not very exciting.
At the same time, if I had had a relative die with a load of cash and possessions and I had acquired something, it would have been sort of rather helpful when I was in school and really quite needy. And I think that's the essential dilemma, is that when you have children, you really do start thinking about a legacy for them and how they're going to think of you. And so you spend 30 odd years in the pursuit of being accommodating to presence, and then you realize that your child should really have better clothes, and it's like, I think I'm going to have to work a bit harder towards
for a larger size of clothes,
or larger sizes of clothes. He's going to want to go to some nice college and study music and repeat the cycle of poverty. So you have to kind of prepare.
These are valid points, and this is where I think the rubber hits the road in terms of yoga philosophy, because we're just demonstrating very clearly that the fundamentalist principles which you find in a lot of old yoga texts, because there's one word that you could definitely apply to pretty much all of them, which is fundamentalist. They talk in very extreme terms about ultimate states and this and not that, and that just doesn't relate to the messy reality of the 21st century householder path. So we have to find some way of deciding where we compromise. And what unfortunately a lot of people seem to do out there is to just pretend that whatever it is that circumstance requires of them is pretty much what Patanjali was getting at, and they find some way of sticking it all out there in that language. Even if it's down to Patanjali's Sthira Sukhamasanam. Yes, of course that means vinyasa flow, of course, it started with Krishnamacharya, probably began with Vivekananda in some ways. Let's disconnect it all from the commentarial tradition and make it mean what we like. But reality, though, is that texts do have meanings. They do have contexts. And it's, at the same time, as I was saying earlier, not in any way realistic to imagine that we can shift time and space to the extent that we can adopt those different contexts. We are here right now. So we have to admit there's a gap and decide, how we're going to accommodate that gap and reframe things and admit that's what we're doing and basically do our own philosophizing instead of, trying to make the old texts serve, future objectives. I suppose that's why I called my podcast what I did, because I'm always trying to explore how we're repurposing ideas to make them relevant without necessarily abandoning the spirit of them. I think it's possible to keep some of the essence alive without at the same time being totally stuck in whatever prescriptive model these older ideas might suggest.
It's so interesting because I feel like this is the same issue that like every fundamentalist kind of tradition has. Do you read the Bible and take it literally? Do you read the Quran and take it literally? Do you read the Upanishads or the Vedas and take them literally? Right? Like, it's sort of the same problem that every I guess, religious tradition or spiritual tradition has is how far do you reinterpret, or how do you interpret the text in a new way to make sense of how we are now? And then there's also maybe a stronghold of people that are really like, no, this is, trying to apply it to current life, which is quite far from.
One of the things I had heard when we were in our little Sanskrit class in Mysore is that one of the failings of modern religions is that they've so much divorced the mystic experience from the reality of their organization. And if you have a mystic experience and you can relive the experience of, say, trans-universal love, then that's present in you when you meet the other. But if you haven't had that experience and all you've had is a code of edicts that will allow someone to have a mystic experience, so we all must follow that code of edicts or we're going to cut off your fucking head. And that's kind of what you see. And how do you reinvest in allowing space for that?
Excellent question. I mean, institutions don't like the anarchistic threat of people figuring stuff out for themselves and deciding to dispense with the institution. So that's always been the problem. And yoga is at its heart quite anarchistic in that sense. It says you figure this stuff out for yourself. It's always had a kind of connection to lineage traditions, though, as well. So in a way, you defer to the boss to a certain extent. But the idea is eventually, you don't need to hang around the boss anymore because what he tells you to do will work. And, you will be one of these characters who stands outside time. And so I think, it's very hard to combine institutions with genuine mystical experience without everybody standing up and ending up being, also being potentially the Messiah. It's Monty Python's Life of Brian. It's suddenly like, he's the Messiah. No, he's not. He's a very naughty boy. It's the same problem. We're all just people. We're all just doing our stuff. No matter what state of realization we might imagine we've attained, we're still human and subject to the challenges of being a human being in this body in this lifetime. And I've never met anybody yet who had completely escaped that. They might have had more refinement in their awareness of what's going on and more skill at accommodating the true nature of things. But in the end, it's still a moment-to-moment practice in that sense. So that's the thing that has to be practiced, showing up in each moment with that awareness. And that's something that doesn't need to have anything to do with an institution. At the same time, how do you transmit it unless you've got a lineage structure of people sharing ideas that's passed down? The problem is the passing down. I mean, that word tradition comes from Latin and it means handing over. So handing over from one generation to the next. But it also has the connotation, therefore, of handing over in the sense of giving people up for punishment. So betrayal. There's something there about the tension between those two possibilities of keep holding fast to the certainty and completely surrendering all of it. And somehow the living nature of tradition is a constant process of reinvention. And you see this in all Indian philosophies, certainly that's what I know best, I suppose, from my recent studies. But I think we see it in the world at large. People are always reinventing stuff and saying it was always that way. It's how it's how we invented the royal family in the United Kingdom. This sort of 19th century publicity stunt to try and ensure that they hang on to their wealth and status was cooked up.
Or they'll be
killed. Yeah, I mean, they could have gone down that road. They decided, because we didn't have a written constitution, it was probably safer to turn them into a tourist attraction than it was to try and deal with the messy business of unwinding, 1,000 years of fudges.
Safer for them.
They would just get a big demotion at this point.
I think they're doing that to themselves.
Yeah, I mean, you look across the channel and you see what happened to them. It's like, well, let's be nice.
I was thinking when we were talking about the tradition and constantly reinventing itself, how yoga now is very much related to health and wellness and beauty and, having a good body. I feel like these are all the things that keep getting reinforced in our modern yoga world, right? Like yoga, the strength, the flexibility, sure, the stamina, the ability to do advanced postures, to do handstands, to do back bends. Basically become an acrobat. And you are an advanced yoga practitioner. But that's also related very much to health and wellness. And this, again, misconception that we have that to be healthy is to be thin, to be beautiful, to be youthful, right? Which is actually not true at all. And so we have all these misperceptions of what it means to be well, to what it means to be healthy, to what it means to be a good yoga practitioner, the benefits of yoga all being very much connected to health and wellness and, how we look, how we act, how we behave, all these things. And from what you were saying, yoga at its heart is actually quite anarchist and actually quite against maybe the norm or society and
holding on to things.
Yeah, holding on to, status quo and tradition and all of these things. It's very much an anarchist kind of revolutionary practice that isn't about the way we look or our health or, all these chillum smoking sadhus.
Well, that's just it. So some of them are just drug addicts, let's face it. But at the same time, they have shown a total disregard for health and wellness in that sense. They don't really care. It's not about the body. And I think the problem is that things that were, until relatively recently in yogic traditions, side effects. So texts have been talking about, your body functions well, or there are health benefits to various techniques, right since, the Upanishads. The Shvetashvatara Upanishad talks about your body gets light and gleaming in the face, and you don't need to go to the toilet much. These are the first signs that yoga is working.
Because you're not eating.
Well, maybe there's that, yeah. Or that you're just so good at processing it that it just gets, churned out once a day. But the idea seems to creep in with modernity that the old ideas that yoga had about the body, which were basically using this kind of alchemical crucible in the torso to blow your mind, were no longer, I guess, compatible with the way that people see reality. And so there was an attempt to map the two bodies to each other, to show that chakras and nadis and kundalini and everything else is just a way of talking about the nervous system. And all sorts of experiments conducted to try to prove that. They're just two different things. They might have an experiential kind of crossover, but they are different things. And since it became less and less easy to be taken seriously, which was one of the concerns, I think, of yoga innovators in the early 20th century, talking about some of these funkier old ideas, particularly once physical yoga was sort of frowned upon by the British colonialists for all sorts of reasons, not least the fact that some of those sadhus did wield weapons against the British East India Company. So it meant that to make yoga compatible with modernity, you have to emphasize something different. And this combination of the popularity of health and well-being through physical exercise, with this resurgence of interest in indigenous traditions as part of the process of overthrowing colonial rule, which is what really gives us modern postural yoga, all those things coming together, that requires a shift in emphasis, and it plays up the idea that basically yoga and Ayurveda are the same things, that it's all about getting the body into its optimal functioning state. And suddenly, actually, the ultimate goal is only something that's paid lip service to. The idea that there's something beyond the body that is the important thing. Yoga has always been for the mind. The Iyengar world, they like to start with a chant to Patanjali, which is based on this misguided, probably, idea that he was a character who wrote texts about medicine, about yoga, and about grammar. There's a different Patanjali who's a grammarian, and it's disputed as to whether there was really an Ayurvedic Patanjali or not. But it starts off with saying, yogena chittasya, So by means of yoga for the workings of the mind. This is what he gave us as a tool. So there's yoga for the mind, there's grammar for speech, and there's Ayurveda for the physical health of the body. So yoga wasn't for the health of the body, yoga's for the health of the mind. Yeah. And the healthy working of the mind is actually, in Patanjali's language, to dismantle it. Mind useless. Stick a spanner in the works, pure Luddite, smash the machines, break down the factories, overthrow capitalism. So it's a radical reframing of what it is to have a mind-body system. You don't need the body to work. It says have disgust for the body, Yoga Sutra 240. Yeah. You don't need a mind. You just need to be. You just need to be a Purusha in some sort of otherworldly state. And let's face it, that's not what most people are teaching these days. It's not what most people are seeking these days. But that is what Patanjali was talking about. So we've had to accommodate the fact that we'll need to do some updating. And then I guess we have to face the reality most of us are looking for ways in to something that might change our mind-body relationship. And doing things with the body is accessible. Even just sitting on the cushion to meditate is a lot less easy to make some progress with than following a sequence of postures. So that's why it's more popular. And the problem is, if we start to get attached to the doing things with the body bit, it all becomes about doing things with the body. And especially with the age of social media, showing everybody else that you're doing things with the body. And we just get stuck on that level. So there's no harm in doing things with the body. We just have to remember that it was always supposed to be a tool to see beyond any kind of attachment to the body. And that's where I think it helps to really study the difference between what old texts are talking about and our modern assumptions, and to interrogate both and to say, we don't sort of stick with the modern assumptions or the fundamentalism of the text. We find this creative synthesis of those two things that serves us without betraying everything about the tradition, which is what you do if you make it just about, looking good naked.
I want to say that in defense of the 14-year-old Instagrammer doing backbends in Long Beach and really pushing her 12 million subscribers to do yoga. In her defense, I think about the modern postural yoga in relationship to state building in India at the turn of the 20th century. 1900, the push towards belonging in the Olympics, to being its own state, to the nationalism of wearing khadi cloth, Sri Aurobindo blowing up the British consulate, and these sorts of propaganda movements, and trying to legitimize yoga as having health benefits and being a equal, let's say, or even just perhaps supreme version of a complete exercise for the mind and body. And it's all sort of being broadcast to the states that are also participating in the Olympics and building up states and gearing up for World War I and World War II. I think, and kind of then that kind of arrives as Hindutva and the current state of India. I think that's a kind of a through line. And it's not that different from what that girl is doing on her Instagram page. It's a kind of propaganda for leverage.
Sure, we've got that now every June 21st with International Yoga Day. Some sort of mini Nuremberg rally with everybody in sequence, busting out some shapes, led by the Prime Minister of India. So there is this kind of awkward synthesis between yoga and politics that's been very productive, as you say, from the point of view of giving us a practice that's actually, something that got us all interested in the first place, because there wouldn't have been modern postural yoga without that kind of intersection. And it's also now given us a different kind of a problem, which is, as white Western yoga teachers, we are being reminded, and I think rightly so, that we need to pay attention to what we're doing with this tradition that we didn't grow up in, and think carefully about how we relate to it and whether we're being respectful to its fundamental principles, even if we're not going to be fundamentalists. Then it's often the case that people don't know what to do about that. And rather than do what we've been talking about, which is thinking for ourselves and trying to be responsible and, being fully autonomous in the sense of, I'm going to engage in what makes sense to me, and, I'm not expecting everybody to like it, and I'm also not going to reframe my identity around whether somebody calls me a cultural appropriator or not. But at the same time, I'm going to listen if someone's going to criticize me to see whether there's something I need to think about here, whether my own bullshit has got in the way of my clear seeing, to come back to the earlier language, that's a project. It's a difficult project. It's something that most people don't know how to engage in because we haven't got support structures. How many yoga studios have got a session once a week where you all sit down and talk about this stuff? I don't know of any. And you might get to do a bit of it in teacher training if you're lucky, but most of the time you're too busy trying to learn all the other things, and the bit where you talk about ideas gets shrunken down into the 8 limbs, the chakras, and maybe that's it. And we really need this opportunity to speak. I mean, it's what I do. It's what I'm about to launch a program for a year-long kind of immersion in the history and philosophy of yoga, as well as how the hell do we make sense of our place in all of that. Which I'll be offering through my website, truthofyoga.com, if anyone's listening and wants to sign up to find out more. But the reason I mention that is because if we don't have some kind of support for engaging in that sort of inquiry for ourselves, it's very tempting to turn to the shouty voice that says, I'm going to help you decolonize your yoga practice. You just sign up for my Hindutva re-education program, which is something that there's plenty of out there.
Yeah. All of this conversation made me think of a couple of things. One is I feel like part of our current yoga circumstances really was like this perfect immersion of physical yoga happened in North America at the same time as jazzercise and aerobics, And I think without jazzercise and aerobics, we would have a very different yoga culture than we do today. But it was like the perfect storm of just synergy. Like, I want spiritual jazzercise. I want spiritual aerobics,
Jane Fonda happened at
it's something to think
right
about.
time.
Yeah, it's something really to think about because I'm not sure we would have the same attraction to it as.
But it's a massive generation of baby boomers that were aging at just the right time.
Just the right time that they were like, I can't do all this jumping anymore. Let's do some longer hold stretches and still get the same benefits and still wear our leotards.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And then when Madonna goes on Oprah Winfrey and says, this is how I've got such great toned upper arms.
Exactly. And then the celebrities kind of boosted up definitely the Ashtanga world. But then also what you were saying about like questioning the origins, the authenticity of where we're getting our knowledge from and where we're getting our teachings from, I think is so important. Just having that ability to question and think for yourself about things and not just accept everything that's being taught or spoke about at face value, I think is critical at this time and stage, especially in the age where it's like everyone is a influencer and everyone is an authority and an expert on I mean almost every topic you can think of, right? Like this idea of having an expertise or having to go and travel to someone somewhere to learn something and having their reputation, their years of study, their years of knowledge be of weight, right? Even that word guru. I mean, nobody's a guru anymore. Nobody holds the weight of the years of the study of the teachings so much. I mean, maybe not nobody. That's maybe a large overstatement. But we just are fed the information for free, and it's very light. It's very excessive and.
Well, back to our Latin study. I mean, that's the whole thing about a certificate.
Yeah.
Cert means truth. And so if someone has a degree from Cambridge, then we can assume all sorts of things about them and assume their knowledge base, take it for granted, not challenge it, hire them at the New York Times, and move on. Whereas, a lot of people went to school at Cambridge that year, and they have a wide spectrum of ability and knowledge bases that we just assume because it was that school that they're fundamentally good. We assume goodness.
Well, it's true, and it's worrying when you realize what it is that is being evidenced by having ticked that box, because it's something I reflected on quite a lot as a brand, but The way that you're taught there is in itself quite alarming. I went and did 3 years undergraduate degree in history once a week.
I didn't mean to diminish Cambridge at all. That wasn't my point.
Let me add it. We went through this course where once a week I had to go and sit with a professor who was very knowledgeable and present an essay that I had written based on very little reading that I'd stayed up all night to write. And then they would tear it to shreds and explain why I didn't know anything. But that's all I had to do once a week. So that's partly why I got to sit around and get high all the time, because I didn't have to go to any classes, didn't have to do any work. And so what it actually taught me, which is what it teaches a lot of people who then go on to run the country or become captains of industry or lawyers or other people who are very skilled at, on the basis of a plausible level of understanding and skill with words, capable of manipulating other people's understanding of stuff. It's to be a bullshit artist. And I was a very good bullshit artist. I was trained in this capacity to hoover up a lot of information very quickly, sort of come to some relatively plausible sounding synthesis of it, and then spit it out and then go, phew. And actually, by the end of the course, I figured out that I didn't even need to bother to do that. I just needed to turn up and say, I'm really sorry, I'm having a bit of a problem this week. I didn't write my essay. And they'd say, you stupid fool, this is the stuff that you should have read. And if you'd really studied, you would have learned this. And I just write it all down and then go and regurgitate that in the exam. So this is how these kind of skills are passed down that enable people to be such lightweight politicians as we've had, in a succession in recent years running our country, all of whom went to Oxford. And it's worrying. And so when I saw sort of that was partly what had enabled me to succeed in life, I got very depressed and thought I actually wanted to know something rather than just know how to pretend to know things. So yeah, little rant over.
This is like the heart, I guess, of like another really challenging question of our time is how do we decipher what is authentic or who has the credibility or the credential or the certification? What is true? How can we? How can we know?
Didn't you?
What's the truth of yoga?
Let's see this book. Let me have a gander. The truth of yoga.
Let's have a look here. What does it say? Page 1. No, it might have to be page 2. Yeah, page 2. There has never been any such thing as one true yoga.
Okay.
So the problem is that everybody wants to tell you the truth, and it's only a partial truth. Nobody's got the truth. There is almost no such thing. When we talked earlier about things beyond words, maybe that's the truth, but can't bottle that and package it.
Can't write a book about that.
So it's very, very hard. No, exactly. And what I tried to do in this book was to summarize what the main yoga texts say, so that we can at least be clear about that side of the story, and also be clear about the fact that they're probably not saying what we'd like them to say, and therefore that we might need to do some reframing and rethinking and to be honest about that. And that's how we deal with the cultural appropriation question. It's not to sort of pretend that we're not going to change anything. It's to be totally open and transparent about what we're adapting to circumstance, which actually isn't what a middle generation of reinventors have done on our behalf, such as Krishnamacharya, who pretended that all these things were either revealed to him in a dream or written on long lost documents that nobody's now able to have a look at. So you don't get to see the join where he gets two different things and bolts them together, and I think we can talk about that. But coming back to the honest question, the difficult question, the honest answer is it's very difficult to tell who's worth listening to, and I think actually all we can really do is to be skeptical, to try things on for size, and to ask questions. And my own personal rule of thumb is anybody who doesn't like me asking awkward questions is not somebody I want to spend any time with. Also, as a teacher, if anybody just wants to endlessly ask me awkward questions and not think for themselves, I'm not that interested either, because that's part of the point is not just to be a fly in the ointment, but to think creatively. But I think that's what we have to do, is ask questions. And in these traditional lineages that we've been part of, there wasn't much space for that to a certain extent. Partly language barrier. I mean, I spent most of my formative years in the Iyengar world. I met Mr. Iyengar. He was terrifying. And I wouldn't have dared ask him anything. At the same time, there was this sort of idea that was passed down the chain of this is the truth and don't question it. So you couldn't even ask your local teacher anything because they would just refer it back up the chain. It comes from Guruji. So it was just all inflexible dogma, right, left and centre. So when I then sort of dabbled in Ashtanga after that, I had no interest in learning the dogma or trying to submit to any of it anyway. And I guess that's what freed me up to think a bit more independently. But now that we don't even have necessarily those same structures of hierarchy, or there's a lot more openness, or there's so many people involved that not everybody gets to ask the questions anyway, it's just a different situation. So I guess we have to ask ourselves questions, but it's most important to me when somebody's trying to tell us something to say, well, on what basis are you telling me this? And if they can show you, like say, well, I'm trying to explain what it says in this text, in this line, and here are some translations that you can go and look it up in. And if you really want to see the Sanskrit, here it is. And here's where I think this person has slightly reframed that to serve his agenda because he's actually a Vaishnava and it's a Shaiva text. And you can get into all of the internets. And if somebody speaks that language, then at least, you can verify what they're saying. It's like they've got footnotes in the book and you can go to the footnotes and look up the footnotes and actually they do say what this person claimed they said. Then, perhaps there's something to learn there. But nobody is the guru in terms of the source of dogma. We need to get out of the mindset of thinking that anybody's got the answer. There is no magic answer apart from to ask the question. If we keep asking and inquiring, we've got this alertness and aliveness that might be helpful. Otherwise, we shut down the mind and waited for somebody else to fill us with all the things that we think that we need, rather than being engaged in a process of seeking.
Daniel is just the person I would have kicked out of my class in Brighton. Yeah, I would have enjoyed that. And I'm sorry we missed each other.
You could have just given me a really hard pose and a really strong adjustment.
There's no questions here, mate. You just keep your trap shut. This has been really gorgeous. I really want to thank you for your time. And it's really a great pleasure. Where can we buy your book?
Give us all the info. And when are you starting your course?
Yeah, well, all good bookshops hopefully will be able to order it for you. It probably won't be in that many of them, but it's published in the US by North Point Press, who published a bunch of other Ashtanga-ish books. The Guruji book was once out by them. Edwin Bryant's Yoga Sutra book, same publisher. But truthofyoga.com. If you go there, you will find all of my information and courses on all of the main yoga texts that you can study either on demand or if you catch the right moment. I run them all live periodically. So we have Q&A where we can interact in the way that this podcast has proceeded, rather anarchically in all sorts of different directions, depending on who shows up and what they're interested in. And the year-long program that I'm going to be launching, that's going to start at the end of September. So it'll run through a full academic year. It's basically a mixture of what I have taught at SOAS on their Yoga Masters program, stripped of some of the more sort of dense and, let's say, tangential academic stuff and made practitioner relevant by focusing on what do we do with this information. And so there'll be a mixture of me presenting pre-recorded talks that summarize stuff, reading for you to go away and do, assignments to prepare for the main event, which is every couple of weeks a 90-minute seminar discussion where we just try to make sense of stuff and try to figure out how we would then put it into practice, whether as a teacher in terms of how do we integrate some of this knowledge into what we present, or whether it's as somebody living in the world who wants to try and have a little spark of that yogic inspiration come alive in day-to-day life. So we won't actually be engaging in a lot of yoga practice, but hopefully it will be practitioner infused to the extent that it seems relevant and directly applicable, rather than dry and dusty and belonging in a long closed library that nobody dares enter any longer.
I mean, I love it. I love listening to philosophy and talking about these things and yogic texts, and to me this is like the heart of the yoga practice. I think the physical asana brings the experience to life in some ways, but if you don't know what you're looking for, then how are you going to know it when it shows up?
Exactly. We need a map and a compass so we can navigate, and that's what the philosophy's for. And you don't need much of it. Not everybody has to go and do a full year-long program, but if we don't
although
know anything,
recommended.
Well, of course, truthofyoga.com. Thank you
so
both. This has been a
much.
lovely chat. No, it's been really rich.
You're
Great
so
questions. Real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
You too. That's it. We've concluded another episode of the Finding Harmony podcast. I just want to thank you so much for doing the work that changes the world, starting with yourself. It truly does make a huge difference. Please make sure you have your automatic downloads turned on wherever you listen so you don't miss any of the upcoming episodes. I have so much more magic I can't wait to share with you. Lastly, if you're on Instagram, I love connecting and hearing from you. So come on over and say hello at Finding Harmony Podcast. And you can also come say hello to me personally at Harmony Slater Official. Thank you again for being here. I cannot wait to share more with you in our next episode.